Welcome to another True North Talk. I've covered a fair bit in recent months the fight against the federal carbon tax, a fight that's taking place in courts in Ontario, Saskatchewan, soon to be Alberta. We have New Brunswick as well that's been joining these fights. And despite the ruling that came out from the Saskatchewan court that the carbon tax is constitutional, there's another dimension to this, which is that if politically it becomes untenable to do it, the legal analysis is pretty irrelevant. But I want to talk about this in both contexts here. Very pleased to welcome Jim Karahalios, who is the founder of Axe the Carbon Tax, which you can get at axethecarbontax.ca. Jim, good to talk to you. Thanks for coming on today.
Hey, Andrew, thanks for having me on. It's always good to talk to you.
I want to go back to the beginning here because I think that as much as this battle is characterized as being left versus right, that really wasn't the start of Axe the Carbon Tax. Tell me how this came about for people that aren't in Ontario.
Well, if you remember back in 2017, we had Ontario PC leader Patrick Brown, who won the leadership of the PC party in Ontario against carbon taxes and kind of like a fiscal conservative. And then he came out and shocked everyone at his first convention, said he was actually in favor of a carbon tax. At the same time, Brian Pallister, the newly elected PC Manitoba premier, he also came out and said he was going to put a carbon tax. And with those two conservative provincial leaders, and especially Patrick Brown, it kind of paved the way for Justin Trudeau to say he was going to impose it. Because if you remember in 2015, Trudeau said he was going to work cooperatively. And then as soon as Brown said he was going to bring it in, a few months later, Trudeau changed gears and said he was going to mandate a carbon tax across the country. So I thought it paved the way. You know, the Liberals depend on Ontario's seats. So I started the Axe the Carbon Tax campaign because it's really a defining issue for Conservatives to kind of get Patrick Brown and Brian Pallister. We actually started the campaign in Manitoba to change their mind on a carbon tax and oppose a carbon tax, just like our federal Conservative Party and most of the candidates running in that. It was supposed to be kind of like this quote unquote inside baseball policy discussion for Conservatives. The whole thing blew out of proportion when Patrick Brown and the PC party executive threw me out of the party, denied me entrance into their convention, and sued me. All three of those, I think, are a first for the PC party of Ontario. Certainly there hasn't been a political party that sued anyone before or denied them access to a convention. And I beat their lawsuit in court in 6 weeks as a decision by a judge that saw through it as an attempt to kind of shut me down, freedom of speech type issue. And shortly thereafter, we went to the PC leadership. All the candidates in that leadership said they were against the carbon tax. Obviously, Doug Ford won. And we went into a general election campaign in Ontario where really the only campaign promise that Doug kept going back to was to scrap the carbon tax. And he ended up scrapping the cap and trade carbon tax. And I think that was the domino or the trigger for conservative leaders across the country to you really take a second look at either being in favor of a carbon tax or being quiet on it. And we see now this national debate on the carbon tax that's going into the federal election.
Conservatives have always been the ones fighting against taxes. I mean, that whether they do it effectively or not is a different story, but that's always been the cornerstone of conservatism. If you're a conservative candidate, the safest thing you can do is be anti-tax. So why has there been this temptation for Patrick Brown, for Brian Pallister to go into that pro-carbon tax, especially a carbon tax, which is probably one of the worst of taxes? Why is that temptation there for purported conservatives?
Look, I want to give Manitoba Premier Pallister credit because he's still holding strong against the carbon tax. You know, there's a bit of this temptation, I think, with pressure from the left to say we've got to say something about it, or conservative leaders, even in the federal party, that always just want to cut their losses and cut a deal and say, oh, we can't oppose this, we can't oppose that. But if you really keep backpedaling on it, you know, what's left to define us from the Liberals? I think it'll be a consequence of us continually losing elections if we adopt carbon pricing as a mainstay conservative policy in Canada. 90% of, polls have been released, 80 to 90% of conservative voters are against it. And most polls show that the vast majority of Canadians, regardless of province, are against a carbon tax. And I also think that there are specific interests. Look, I think the green lobby that wants a carbon tax is very well funded. They have lobbyists in every level of government. We don't know what's discussed in those private meetings with ministers at any level. They're really pushing it hard. And if you look at it on the other side, the corporate interests that should be against the carbon tax are not. They're a bunch of pushovers. Most of the oil CEOs have backed off it, and they say they're for it. They've sold out on the issue. And because it's not really a corporate issue, it's a taxpayer issue. Because an oil company can get a carbon tax slapped on them. They'll just pass the cost down to the consumer or the taxpayer, whatever you want to call it. And so the consumer is really left without a choice on the product they're going to use. They have to swallow the carbon tax. It's not going to change the environment. They don't have a voice for someone to lobby for them the way these corporate interests do on the left to impose a carbon tax. And it really is the best way for government to take money from taxpayers, fill government coffers, and hand out government handouts by their friends, by certain placements, by certain projects, in certain ridings they want, to certain corporations. So it really is terrible, even just from beyond the policy. It's terrible from the politics as well.
Well, I'm actually glad you brought that up, because you have a few different battlegrounds for this. You've got the legal side, is it constitutional, that's going on through the courts now. You've got, is it good politics or not, which I know has been a big part of the last little while with the Patrick Brown era and now the Doug Ford era of the PC party. And then you've got the efficacy. Is it good for the environment? Is it good for the economy? Does it accomplish its goals? Where has been the crux of your opposition? Because I know you are a lawyer, so I know you can understand the constitutional side of this thing, but where has your primary focus been on tackling this?
What do you mean by that, Andrew, in terms of?
Well, look, I mean, you could argue, look, this is just not the purview of the federal government. You could argue this is bad for politics, it's bad for conservatives, or you could argue this doesn't work. And I'm curious if you've taken one specific part of that that's been your focus, or if really all of it has been the focus.
I see. Right. Well, I think it's all of the above. But the key to the carbon tax campaign that I think that's been overshadowed is at its core, it's a question of integrity and accountability, right? You have conservatives who, when they're looking for a vote in a leadership, say that they're against carbon taxes and they are fiscal conservatives. They brand themselves a certain way to get that vote. And after they get the position they want, they reverse course and they tell their voters that they're actually for some form of a carbon tax. That was certainly the case with Patrick Brown. And if you look, there was a poll out the other day that said the number one issue that voters are going to be looking at the federal election has nothing to do with policy. It has to do with integrity and ethics of the politicians. Because if you present yourself a certain way to your voters and you get those votes and then you decide to reverse course, that's frowned upon, I think, even more than if you present a certain policy position that voters won't agree with, but they at least respect you for explaining and taking the position. Certainly that's why Brian Pallister suffered, why Patrick Brown suffered amongst his voters. And I think that's an interesting thing to look at in the federal election as well. And that, that betrayal of the base, or the people that are going to get you the vote to win, is, I think, at the top of the issue for the thousands of people that support the campaign and are against the carbon tax.
That's a really good point you mentioned. About, I guess it would have been 2 years ago when the federal leadership race was on, I was moderating a debate, and there were, at the time, like 97 candidates or something for the leadership. And at this debate, we go down and, it takes 3 hours to get from one end to the other. And then Michael Chong, who was the leadership candidate, a conservative MP, says, I support a revenue neutral carbon tax. And there were a few people that booed him at that point. And I actually, as much as I found it to be just a reprehensible notion that the Conservative Party would champion a carbon tax, I very much appreciated the transparency of it. And I think that you're bang on there. People have a lot more respect for someone who says, look, this is what I believe, this is my goal, versus someone who changes that goal depending on whether their audience is the internal party battle or trying to win over the hearts and minds of the media and all of these other things. And that's where I do think that it's going to backfire on anyone that does that bait and switch.
I agree completely. And the other thing that we keep hearing, this false narrative, it's complete baloney. This false narrative that if conservatives don't adopt a carbon tax, they can't win. And this is the thing that was being pushed. And Ford won the leadership, went into the general election. Basically, he kept going back to scrap the carbon tax because the campaign was not very good because of all the distractions with rigged nominations, voter fraud, corruption in the party. He kept going back to scrap the carbon tax, and he got 2.3 million votes, which is the most votes that any party has ever gotten in Ontario's history. No one cracked 2 million. Only Mike Harris, the former PC leader and premier of Ontario, cracked 2 million. Ford was only the second person to crack 2 million, and he didn't have a position in favor of carbon pricing. And yet, even after he wins, we've got this proposal he has out that's supposed to come in this summer on industrial emission standards, where he agrees on the Paris targets, he agrees with carbon pricing, he wants to replace the federal version with an Ontario version and generate $400 million for Ontario coffers. So there's something in the narrative amongst the lobbyist class and the media class that kind of pushes this idea that if you don't adopt carbon pricing, you can't win. And yet all the evidence suggests conservative parties will suffer if they adopt carbon pricing, and they can win in opposition to carbon pricing. And yet it doesn't seem to matter to some people. They keep pushing the narrative because it is a clever narrative from the left, right? Kind of getting the conservatives to drift to the left, where there's no difference between them and they lose their base of support and the support starts collapsing.
Well, and I saw that. I was sitting in the courtroom for the Ontario carbon tax appeal back in April, and in the Ontario case as well as the Saskatchewan case, the governments of Saskatchewan and Ontario, and also in the Ontario case, the lawyer representing the United Conservative Party, which is now the government of Alberta, they were arguing tooth and nail that no, we agree with everything the federal government says about global warming and the environment and climate change. We agree it's a danger. We agree. And if they do, fine. But when you accept all of those premises, you set yourself up for exactly what you're describing, which is then, okay, what are you going to do about it? And I feel that is putting conservatives in a corner in a way. I mean, they're putting themselves there because they don't want to say, well, actually, we don't think it's as bad as you say, or we don't agree with this particular part of your findings or your statement. And you're always going to then be forced with, okay, well, what are you going to do about it? And then you get governments like Doug Ford saying, okay, we have to put an Ontario solution forward. And I know Andrew Scheer will be in that same position.
And the key thing that, it's really simple. The key thing that you mentioned is, if you concede the argument that the Paris Accord and the arbitrary number that Justin Trudeau picked of 30% reduction in emissions, if you concede the argument that all of that in carbon pricing will solve climate change, then I don't know how you win in court and say that the federal government shouldn't put it in because our provincial carbon price or carbon tax is better or just as good. It's a really weak position to go into. They should have went into court poking holes into the entire Paris Accord, the arbitrary targets for every country, the fact that if Canada reduces its emissions by 30%, global emissions will go up because of carbon leakage. They should have poked holes in all of that instead of coming forward and saying we have our own carbon tax, carbon price through regulatory means. That's the Ford government, and betraying the voters that voted for him on the pledge to scrap the carbon tax. Andrew Scheer is going to be in the same position. I don't think he's going to look. He won the leadership. He was the strongest against the carbon tax. I think if you go back to that federal leadership, and one of the things that we haven't discussed is Bernier was actually pretty weak on the entire carbon tax question. He put most of his ammo on supply management. If he was as hard against the carbon tax as Andrew was, maybe he could have squeaked it out. So Scheer's going to have a challenge here to see, all the voices in his caucus, and there's obviously voices like Michael Chong that want the party to adopt a carbon tax, and we'll see which road they go later in the month. But, I'm an advocate against the carbon tax. 90% of conservatives are against the carbon tax, and my job's to hold their feet to the fire regardless of party, regardless of stripe, because it really is a conservative position to take. And if they don't want to take it, they can't just hide behind the blue sign and the capital C Conservative in the title.
I think Doug Ford's win in Ontario came down to a lot of things. I think opposition to carbon tax was a part of it, but frustration with Kathleen Wynne and the Liberals, frustration with hydro rates, all of these, and the integrity issue that you mentioned earlier. When push comes to shove, looking ahead to the federal election, do you think carbon tax is the ballot issue for a lot of people? Because the one reason I asked that, when I was knocking on doors as a candidate, only one person mentioned the environment was their top priority. I asked thousands of people. One person said the environment. That's it. Whereas I had hundreds that said, thousands actually, that said taxes, cost of living, etc. So do you think the carbon tax specifically can be a ballot issue that is a winning one for Conservatives?
I think if you go back to what I said earlier, the poll that was out the other day that said the number one issue for voters is integrity and ethics from a politician. And how that ties into policy is voters always look, are you consistent with the message and the vision that you're selling us? Or are you flip-flopping and are you wishy-washy? Or are you just changing your mind based on whoever puts a microphone in front of your face? And are you going to cave when the pressure mounts? Doug Ford did not only win because Kathleen Wynne was unpopular. If you look at the numbers, the Liberal vote dropped, and most of that vote went to the NDP. They kind of traded numbers, 1.1 and 1.8 million voters. But Doug Ford and the PC party's votes went from 1.5 million to 2.3. He got 800,000 more voters than we had gotten under Ernie Eves, John Tory, and Tim Hudak in the last 4 elections. And those are Conservatives who largely just skipped the last 4 elections. And it closely resembles the Stephen Harper vote of 2 million. And what drove that was obviously people were tired of Kathleen Wynne, which is why the Liberal vote collapsed. But based on the Ford Nation brand that Rob Ford built and presenting a fiscal conservative and a conservative vision of Ontario inspired 2.3 million voters to come out. And if he starts backing off with industrial emission standards and starts wavering every time the heat gets pushed, that 2.3 million will collapse very quickly. We're seeing it in the polls right now. And federally as well, I think carbon taxes is a serious issue. But what's more serious for voters is in the integrity and the principles and the ethics of the candidate. Are they standing behind the vision that they've always had, or will they cave under the pressure? Will they inspire people, or will they just tell people what they want to hear in any certain interview at a certain time? I think that's what it always comes down to. Policy is difficult. You have the base of every party that agree with their policies, and you've got the small, quote unquote, swing voter that could be persuaded. You've got to persuade the largest number of people to vote for you at the end of the day.
Well, I think you've hopefully persuaded some people with your comments today. Jim Carahallios, founder of Axe the Carbon Tax, joining us now. Thanks a lot, Jim. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew.